Hi, welcome back. Our previous lesson was on price ceilings and price floors. Today we'll be looking at quantity regulation. So previously we learned that sometimes the government steps in to regulate prices directly. Now, just as the government might set maximum or minimum price for the market, it can also set quantity regulations. Now, quantity regulation is the maximum or the minimum quantity that can be sold or bought. So, in this case, quantity regulation can either be directly imposed on sellers, restricting the quantity sold, or it can be imposed on buyers, restricting the quantity that can be bought. Now, an example of quantity regulation is quotas. It could be import quotas, educational quotas, employment quotas, or several other examples. Now, let's consider a zoning law that imposes a quota limiting the number of houses that can be built in a given area. So, assume that the government realizes that an area is too crowded and decides that for a period of time, a specific number of houses should be allowed to be built in that area. And the number of houses built should not exceed that threshold. Now, on this curve, we can see that before the government ever imposes the quantity regulation, the supply and demand intersect at point A, which implies that the equilibrium price is 200,000 per house and the equilibrium quantity is 500,000 houses being built in that area. So let's assume that instead of 500,000, the government imposes a quota that says that the number of houses that can be built in this area in a given period shouldn't exceed 420,000. Now, this zoning law imposes a maximum quantity of 420,000 houses that can be built in the area. So, at this quantity, suppliers will be willing to sell if the price is at least 130,000 per house. And when we map this same quantity to the demand curve, we realize that buyers will be willing to pay up to 240,000 for these houses. So if the quantity regulation is imposed on sellers, then competition among buyers will push the price up to 240,000. And if the quantity regulation was imposed on buyers, then competition among sellers will push the price down to 130,000 per house. Now, what we are saying here is that quotas raise prices when imposed on sellers. This is because a quota imposed on sellers restricts the quantity that can be sold. Consumers would therefore be willing to pay more for the limited quantity available. However, quotas reduce prices when they are imposed on buyers. This is because the quota imposed on buyers restrict the quantity that can be bought. Sellers would therefore be willing to charge less to clear the excess quantity available. So looking at this curve, we realize that suppliers will be willing to charge 130,000 per house at the quantity of 420,000. If the quota was imposed on buyers, this is going to restrict the quantity that can be bought. And then sellers, in an attempt to clear the excess quantity available, will reduce their price from 200,000 to 130,000 per house. Now, if the quota was imposed on sellers, it means that there'll be shortages in the market. That means that it's restricting the quantity of houses that can be built. So consumers will be willing to pay more. In this case, they will increase the price from 200 to 240 240,000. So each consumer will be willing to pay up to 240,000 per house. One thing to note here is with quantity control, the regulation is determined by the government, and the forces of demand and supply will determine the price that will be charged. So it could end up being higher than the equilibrium price or lower than the equilibrium price, depending on who the quota has been imposed on. So this is all that we have for our lesson on quantity regulation. Our next lesson will be on consumer and producer surplus. If you enjoyed today's lesson, consider subscribing. Thank you.